It's so important how a lot of this comes from within, the structure, the deep and narrow team, the understanding of the roles. There are a lot of key concepts that come into play, and there is no concept talked about as much as we do at Wize than the quad activities. And it'd be really interesting now actually to see how the quad activities will help us gain the perspective to build a robust and effective system and strategy for getting referrals. So with this deep and narrow team, it's also something we can educate them about the quad activities too. If they understood that doing that a client approval meeting would be a quad B activity, it's building up the balance sheet, it's building up that emotional bank account, rather than just sending it out and trying to get the work done. We can start to see a lot more referrals come through, and with the client NPS improving as well. So Ed, would you like to just share with us how we can think about building that system and strategy for getting referrals, through that lens of the four quads?
Sure. And for those of you who are with us on our Wize Growth in the growth program, we take you through this, and we take your staff through this as well. And everything that you do in your business or even privately falls into these four quadrants. And you just want to get rid of quad 3 and 4, and that will give you so much time back. When I remember when I was working in quad 1, which is urgent and important, that's the quadrant where you're putting out fires, all right? You're just putting out fires. I was working over 100 hours a week. And then when I learned this from Dr. Stephen Covey, and I spent my time in quad B, which are urgent things, which are not urgent things, but are very important things, then my workload started to drop. And it's things like, preparing a tax return, doing the grinding work is a quad A activity or quad 1 activity. And you should be delegating that to somebody else to do. Quad 2 or quad B activity is training someone. If you're training someone, it's important, but it's not urgent. So it's a quad 2 activity. It's very important to train that person, but when you've got disasters and fires, out of control, it drags you back into quad 1. But quad 2 are more preventative activities. So when someone says to me, I can't trust somebody else to do the work, well, prepare a checklist. Now, preparing a checklist, I'll say, well, I haven't got time to do a checklist, but the checklist is important, but it's not urgent. But as soon as you prepare that checklist, then you got more confidence in handing that work to somebody to do, and they fill in they fill in the checklist to make sure everything is covered. But trying to do that checklist is where it's really important, where it's hard, because it's important, but it's not urgent. So we jump back into quad 1, which is, I'll just do it myself. It's quicker. So that's the attitude that I get from client managers. It's quicker if I just do it myself, right? But by the time I train someone, I could have just done it. That's all quad 1 activity. If you spend your life in quad 1 activity, you'll be working really long hours like I was. And until I understood this from Dr. Stephen Covey, I was working 100 hours a week. I was burnt out. I was thinking of getting out of the place. And I was trying to address the symptoms and not the problem. And the problem was I was doing the wrong kind of work. And I can't stress that enough. And look, it's not easy, I know. And I still have that trouble with my own senior client managers. They still want to jump in there in quad 1, and they won't spend the time training their staff. So it's not I admit it's not an easy thing, but you've got to lead this. Without leadership from your side, then it won't happen. And because they won't know to do it, because they're under pressure with lodgement dates, they're under pressure with keeping jobs to time to budget. They've got a lot of quad 1 activity that they're working on, so it tends to drag them back into quad 1. But that's been my most difficult challenge, is to get the client managers out of quad 1 into quad 2, which is training their staff. If their staff don't know how to do it, then train them. Don't complain about them, train them, and then make sure that they're the right kind of staff, because some people are not trainable. Doesn't matter how much time you put into trying to train them. They're just not trainable. So if it's a junior person you're training, you have to see improvements every day. If you're not seeing improvements every day, then they're incompetent, and it's best to move them on. So so you've got to get your client managers doing this. Now, if you're a small firm and you're doing this, then it's a lot easier to do it, but trying to get somebody else to do it is always going to be a lot harder. But as a very minimum, you've got to be doing it yourself first in order to be able to then, train somebody else to do it and show them the way. Because if you can't see the outcome, it's very hard to tell someone who can't see the outcome of it or haven't experienced the outcome to follow you. Whereas if you do it yourself and you can see the outcome, you can see the results, you can see, then you can go there with confidence to, because you're always going to get pushback, right? So the staff are always going to push back on you. And you either follow them or they follow you, and you want them to follow you. And in order for them to follow you, you've got to have conviction. And in order to have conviction, you have to have done it yourself and seen the results to have that conviction, to bring them along in that journey with you. So it's not easy. I'll admit that. It's much harder to lead people than it is just to do the work yourself. But in order to get scalability, and in order to get a better lifestyle, in order to run the business properly so that your clients are winning and your staff are winning and the shareholders are winning in your organization, you've got to manage the business properly.
Thank you, Ed. And Tim, I really love the quote that you put into the chat, actually. People who don't have time to work on quad 2 activities are the ones who need to work on quad 2 activities the most. Must have had some firsthand experience working through people to get them thinking quad B, quad 2 as well. What are some of the, if you want to share some insights from the journeys you gained so far, getting your client managers thinking quad B, thinking training the staff, and then how's that affected the outcomes of achieving more referrals or more satisfied clients? And
it's tough. Like Ed said, it's really hard to get other people. If you're not your own client manager, it's really hard to get other people to, in my experience, to buy into this. And you've got to kind of look at what's motivating them. But in my case, I just kind of showed them that it was impossible for them to scale what they were doing. They couldn't scale themselves. So I had one client manager who took on her assistant client manager's fees. So she went from doing 500K to $1 million overnight. And to avoid having a meltdown, we had to kind of really position her to train up the team, because it was a fairly new team she was working with as well. And we always have that 1 year perspective. So we always talk about, and she does a really good job of this now. She says, this is the first year, training everyone up is an investment. She talks a lot like Ed now, which is a good sign. And she said, the second year, it will be easier. And so, yeah, I think I've seen this in my own firm and in a lot of firms. You'll have people who are CPAs or CAs with like 10 years experience who don't know a heap more than a graduate. And it's just a real shame that people haven't invested in them. And I think in Australia anyway, we've got lodgement lists, and if we're late, we get penalties. And I've never met an accountant who isn't really busy or snowed under. And so it's really, really hard to kind of, in that context, to get people to focus on the really, really important things. And you've got to do it nicely, but you can kind of talk about the soil metaphor that Ed talks about, which I mentioned in the chat. You can talk about long term. This isn't sustainable. What we're doing is not sustainable. And so you don't need a huge change. You just need a bit of time each week, each day, each week set aside to training, or a little bit more time set aside to client meetings. And as long as you have that mindset every month getting better and seeing improvements, that's helped me, because I'm quite impatient. I want to go from 0 to 100% the next day. And what I've noticed is nothing changes until people's mindsets change. And the best way to change people's mindsets is through numbers, through facts. Accountants they're quite logical people. So the Fab 5, which everyone should have access to in their SharePoints, has been a big one for me. So we've got the capacity planner in there, the Fab 5 KPIs, and just looking at the same numbers each week, looking at lodgement lists, looking at all that stuff, and then kind of dripping on them, as Ed says, has really helped change people's mindsets. And it's taken a year for some people, but as long as I have that incremental progress, I'm patient now. it's not worth persevering with someone over a year where you see no progress. It's a waste of time. So you do need to see progress, but people kind of take their own time to kind of fully come around and buy into the thinking. And once they do, it's so much easier to manage. So that's the other thing. I'd much prefer someone who's not perfect, who I've been dripping on for a year, than a brand new person who, you know, might take themselves a year to come around to the way we're running it. So I hope that kind of helps, but you do have to be patient because you're dealing with people, and people, there's early, middle, late adopters, as Ed says, and it just takes time to get people to come along on the journey. And there is kind of a light bulb moment where all of a sudden they'll be using the right language, they'll be thinking the right way. And I look back and I think, when did that happen? You know, and it's like having a kid grow up. All of a sudden they're there, and it's quite quite edifying. And the best bit for me, it's taken about 2 years. I've got a much bigger firm, but it's taken about 2 years, but the client managers have come to me, you know, independently and said, this way is a lot better, you know, and they've acknowledged it. And the ones that push back the most have actually come to embrace it the most, which is another reason why it's worth persevering with late adopters. And they're the least likely to change from it as well, which means they take the least amount of managing. So I actually kind of look at late adopters now as a positive, not a negative, for that last reason for me. I hope that makes sense. There's a lot there, but yeah.
And Lee said, you know, where do you get this training? Well, we'll bring them along to your sessions and let them listen. And there is a saying that, you know, the teacher will appear when the student's ready. Now, when will the student be ready? Well, often, you know, they might come to these sessions, and they might have to come to these sessions 20 times before the light comes on. And what Timothy talked about just then, you know, sometimes you feel like you're saying these things like 100 times, and all of a sudden it's a different person. And at what point that happens, we don't know, because the teacher will appear when the student's ready. And why the student's not ready? Well, certain things have to happen, or they have to fall in place before that person's ready. And often it could be, you know, 10 sessions like this. Sometimes it could be 2 sessions like this, and it's like third-party endorsement. When you're trying to prosecute it, that doesn't have the same impact as a third party doing it. So maybe the third party, for them listening to us, switches the light on for them. And then other times it's just repetitiveness, hearing the same thing over and over again. And we get this all the time. People say, you know, I've heard that 10 times. It was only on the 11th that I got it. The light came on. You know, so again, it's this the students, the teacher will appear when the student's ready, and people learn at different rates and different ways. So, but repetitiveness is a very good way of doing it. So bring your staff, bring your managers along, bring the leaders in your organization to come along to listen to these things, because it just doesn't just happen by accident. You know, you've got to actually lead it. You've got to actually, they won't do it on their own because they're so busy at work. So you've got to lead, you've got to bring them along, encourage them to come along. And then yes, they'll push back. They'll say, look, I've got this amount of lodgements to do, and, you know, and my, you know, budgets I'm behind my budgets. But it's a bit like saying, I'm not going to exercise because I've got too much work to do at home, right? When I get the work done at home, then I'll go and exercise. But you've got to get the balance right between the two. You've got to start that exercise. Because exercise is a quad B activity. It's a quad 2 activity. It's important, but it's not urgent. So we tend not to do that. We tend to do all the things that are in quad 1, which is urgent and important. But, you know, if you don't do your quad 2 activities, in this example, exercise, you'll end up with bad health somewhere down the track.
And, you know, part of that, driving the staff to perform a certain way as per their job descriptions with the training all helps guide them in the right direction.